Good evening. My name is Carole Voulgaris. I am an associate professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Design here at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I want to start by offering a quick reminder that we do have live captioning available. For any of you who are joining virtually, you can click the closed captioning icon on the live stream window. If you're here in person and you would like live captioning, you can use the QR code that's on display on the screen there, and you can visit the AV booth if you need any assistance. We do have a very exciting week coming up in GSD public programs. Tomorrow, we will be welcoming political philosopher Nancy Fraser, who will deliver her lecture against the environmentalism of the rich. And then the very next day, on Thursday, as part of the Harvard University Arts Thursdays, the GSD will host artist Michael Wong, who will discuss his work at the intersection of nature and technology. And that's just this week. For more information and to see the full lineup of upcoming events, you can visit the GSD's website. Tonight's lecture is the Jaqueline Tyrwhitt Urban Design Lecture. The lectureship was established in 2010 by alumni and friends in celebration of the Urban Design Program's 50th anniversary. It honors Jaqueline Tyrwhitt, an associate professor who worked to establish and fortify the Urban Design Program during its founding years between 1955 and 1969. The fund allows us to bring visionary urban designers, scholars, architects, and leaders to the GSD who have opened novel directions in urban design thinking and traced new intersections between urban design and other disciplines. And one such leader we're pleased to welcome here today is Deborah Archer. Deborah is the president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the first person of color to serve in that role in the organization's history. She is a nationally recognized expert on civil liberties, civil rights, and racial justice. And she is also the Margaret B. Hoppin Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Community Equity Initiative at New York University School of Law. Prior to full-time teaching, Archer worked as an attorney with the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she litigated in the areas of voting rights and employment discrimination, educational equity, and school desegregation. She is the author of the national best-selling book, Dividing Lines: How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality, which she'll be speaking to us about in a moment. I also want to recognize Portia Dames, who was instrumental in inviting Deborah to join us today and was very patient with us as we organized this event. I'll also say that we've had the pleasure of discussing sections from this book in the transportation justice course that I teach, and our conversations have been greatly enriched by the insights that Deborah offers. So with that, I would like you to all please join me in welcoming Deborah Archer.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Thank you for coming. I will first start with an apology. My voice is struggling a little bit, been doing a lot of traveling, a little bit too much talking, but I am hopeful that it is going to last us through this afternoon. I've got cough drops, I've got tissue, I've got warm tea, so we're going to do the best that we can. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all because I spent a lot of my time talking to lawyers. And my book, really, through this book, I'm hoping to have conversations and reach people who can impact change in a different way. So I'm just a civil rights lawyer trying to tell the stories of what's happening to my clients and their communities. And I'm hoping that I can touch the decision makers, people who are in the rooms that make the decisions about how my clients live their lives and how that community lives their lives. I recently participated in a discussion at the Ford Foundation about monuments. And of course, a lot of the conversation was on statute. So we've had this national conversation, or maybe even a national fight about monuments to white supremacy, about what they represent, who they honor, who they erase. And I really do think that too often that conversation is focused very narrowly on statutes, on the Confederate general, on the colonizer, and who has a statue in the park. And those symbols matter because they tell us who is celebrated and who is honored, who is forgotten. It tells a story about memory and power and belonging. But what is missing about the conversation about monuments is that too many of our communities are also monuments to white supremacy. That built environment speaks to who we honor and who we value, who we have forgotten, whose communities matter and whose don't. The monuments are in the segregated schools that we have in Black and brown communities that have ignored and neglected kids for decades. It's in the hospitals that aren't built, in the water systems that feed lead to communities instead of clean and nourishing water. It's in the parks that aren't there in many communities, and the way that we don't care about the beauty and vitality of some of those communities. And I think that those monuments are important because they help to map racism onto place. And I know that that's what you all think about. And I think it makes sense to me on multiple levels because racism is about place on multiple levels. One of the things that white supremacy depends on is getting Black people and other people of color to know and accept their place socially and then staying there. And what better way to keep people in their place socially than to lock them into their place physically and show them the limits on who they can be and where they can go and where they can worship and who they can be with. Help them understand the limits on their future and their opportunities. And I think that we have done that, really determining where people can and how they can live and walk and rest and play by how we built our built environment. And the story I'm trying to tell in Dividing Lines is the role that transportation infrastructure plays in that story. So for some of the people that I work with, they were really surprised that I was writing a book about transportation infrastructure because they didn't see it as a civil rights issue. But for me, transportation infrastructure is far more, and I'm talking to people like you all know this. These are the people who know this, but it's far more than moving people from A to B. Transportation infrastructure determines who gets locked out, who gets left behind, determines who gets access. Transportation infrastructure is the infrastructure of high quality education, is the infrastructure of a vibrant democracy. It is the infrastructure of everything that everyone in this room cares about. It gets to determine who lives with dignity and respect and who doesn't. And if we don't pay attention to transportation infrastructure and the impact that it has on our communities and people's lives, then we're not really going to be able to change anything that we are working for. And of course, it's really hard to tell the story of racism in the United States without talking about transportation. You can just think about America's second Reconstruction, and you can repeatedly go back to transportation. You think about the Freedom Riders, the Montgomery bus boycott, the people who took to the streets and sidewalks and marched over our bridges to demand respect. And so those folks knew how important transportation was on determining access to opportunity. And we, I think, have forgotten that a little bit because we talk about segregation, we think about the things that we have done to create good and bad communities, communities where they have access to opportunity and communities where there is no opportunity. But we focus on the invisible lines, right? The policies and practices, redlining, and racial zoning laws that help create those. And we ignore the physical boundaries that we draw every day in those communities. And that is the story that I try to tell in Dividing Lines. As legal segregation began to crumble and we saw the success of the civil rights movement, we saw states and communities turn to transportation infrastructure as a more physical and more durable way to perpetuate that racial segregation, to become a post-Jim Crow tool to keep communities down and divided. And so that is an example of the power of racism. Power of racism is in its ability to adapt and to evolve, to find its way into the spaces and the nooks and the crevices that we leave for it. And after Jim Crow, after we saw the success of the civil rights movement, racism evolved into our transportation system in deep and profound ways. Before I go into details, I want to explain a little bit about why my book and my remarks tonight are going to focus on Black people and Black communities. Because although many groups have been harmed by transportation infrastructure, I think every group can talk about ways that transportation infrastructure has harmed them. I think that Black people have had a unique experience, and that's the story that I'm trying to tell. And that comes from a few things. First, there is that deep historical relationship around transportation and Black folks and oppression that I was talking about. It starts in slavery, where we were trying to tie people to the plantations, making it difficult for them to move around, denied access to the means of transportation, and evolved in ways that we were talking about in the civil rights movement into today. I think there's a unique evidence of intentionality when it comes to using transportation infrastructure as a discriminatory tool against Black folks. The way that we layered transportation infrastructure over these other tools that we had been using for decades that were specifically designed to harm Black folks. And then also the really stark second-class citizenship that Black people continue to experience today and persists in kind of all aspects of American life. And finally, I think in transportation and in every context, if you try to tell everyone's story, you don't tell anyone's story. And so the story of Black people and Black communities is the one that I chose to tell in my book, but I don't want it to anyone to think that I think that's the only story that was to be told or that should be told. It's just a story that I told. So I'm going to start with highways, because highways is the mode of transportation infrastructure I think people know the most about and know most about the harm that it's caused, and still are surprised by some of the stories that I tell about transportation infrastructure in my book. So as the judicial decisions and the civil rights laws of the 1950s and 1960s made it harder to segregate Black communities using the zoning laws and those other tools, as I said, we turned to transportation infrastructure. And that picked up after the Supreme Court decided the case of Brown versus Board of Education. And I know you all know what Brown versus Board of Education is, but in case anyone doesn't, 1954 Supreme Court decision that held that separate educational facilities by race was unconstitutional. And so Brown, of course, signaled the fall of racially segregated public education, but it also signaled the fall of segregation writ large because it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the original foundation of that belief that separate could be equal. And so in the wake of the Brown decision, government officials, everyday citizens, saw what was coming down the pike and threatened to use every tool that they had to maintain their segregated way of life. And for about 2 years after that, we saw what was called massive resistance. And during that period, America showed what it was willing to sacrifice to maintain segregation. We shut down schools entirely. We made school attendance optional, the rise of private schools. When we thought it was going to extend to pools, we shut down public pools. We shut down movie theaters, shut down parks. We're willing to make all kinds of sacrifices. And that hit a pitch in 1956 with something called the Southern Manifesto. And that was where 100 federal legislators signed this agreement that said that they would do everything that they could to maintain segregation throughout the country. And 2 months later, the same folks that signed that pledge to use every tool that they had to maintain segregation also signed into law the Interstate Highway Act. And rather than build the interstate highway system against that promise of Brown, where they were going to connect everyone, tear down the walls, bring people together, the Interstate Highway Act was co-opted in so many places as this tool that folks use to resist integration. One of the examples that I talk about in the book is Birmingham, Alabama. And during this time, Birmingham was known as Bombingham because when Black folks started to leave the confines of their segregated communities and to move into white communities, their homes were bombed even before they could move in. And it was happening so frequently that Birmingham became known as Bombingham. And one of the tools that Birmingham used to maintain segregation before the civil rights movement was racial zoning laws, literally drawing a line and saying white folks can live over here, people of color can live over here, Black folks can live over here, and you can't live in a zone not designated for your race. Racial zoning laws were also struck down in 1954. And so when that happened, Birmingham turned to the Interstate Highway Act to replace the invisible boundaries of racial zoning laws with the physical boundaries of the highway. And if you overlay the interstate highway with the racial zoning boundaries. In many places, it follows it exactly. They turned that invisible wall into a physical wall that was a physical barrier and a psychological barrier that removed Black communities and was seen as protection for white communities against Black migration. Similar things happened in Atlanta. White communities went to the mayor and said, we need protection because Black folks are coming into our neighborhoods. And the mayor committed to using the interstate highway as a system of barriers. Atlanta also had racial zoning laws. And if you look at I-20 follows those racial zoning law boundaries in many places. And again, the mayor of Atlanta was very open about how they were using the highway. Some urban planners came to him and said, this doesn't even make sense from a planning perspective to build the highway this way. And he said, we cannot change anything. I promised the white communities that I would protect them with the highway, and that's what we're going to do, and that's where they built the highway. Another example I talk about in the book is Indianapolis, Indiana. They had another tool in Indianapolis called redlining, and I'm sure you all know what redlining is. Again, drawing red lines around communities and saying, you're not going to get any investment. You can't get a mortgage for your home. We are not going to give you a loan to repair your home. You can't get a business loan. And what you would see then, of course, is that community deteriorating from lack of investment, a lack of resources and opportunity. In Indianapolis, they have two major highways, I-65 and I-70, and they intersect in downtown Indianapolis. It's just enormous and overwhelming to see the way these highways come together. And if you overlay the intersection of I-65 and I-70 with the redlining map, the communities that were destroyed were only the redlined communities. And of course, the folks who built the highway there said, well, we used the land that was the cheapest. And that's how we decided where to build the highway. But they don't acknowledge the role that we had in making that land the cheapest, that the land there was the cheapest because we deprived it of all the investments and resources that folks needed to live and build a happy and vibrant and well-resourced community. And of course, there's a story in every state, literally every state, about a community of color, mostly Black communities that were targeted, sometimes integrated Black and Jewish communities, because both groups were denied access to housing in other communities and chose to live together in many places. And so those communities were destroyed, and every state has a story to tell about that. And of course, the highway system was not built on a blank slate, didn't just go through grassy areas. It destroyed and removed people and homes, and as I said, communities. The United States Department of Transportation estimated that more than 475,000 households and more than 1 million people were displaced nationwide as a result of the original construction of the highway, and those folks were all disproportionately Black. And the focus on who was displaced, I think, really underestimates or undersells the harm. Because millions more people were forced to live in these hollowed out communities where they have lost everything. They've lost their neighbors. They've lost the sense of community, the kind of resources that helped make life possible. Black businesses were disproportionately destroyed. Black churches really tore at the social fabric. And those communities now kind of bear the harm of the decades of compounded disadvantage, racialized poverty, deep segregation, lack of economic investment, really just gutted the core of those communities and impacted individual families. We know that home ownership is an important part of personal wealth and creating generational wealth. And so many Black folks were deprived of that because when their homes were taken, they were either given nothing or very little for their homes as a result. And so they're still dealing with the physical and economic and psychological impact. But beyond highways, we did the same thing with roads and street grids. Right? All across the country, there are major roads that were built in ways to divide Black communities from other communities, to remove Black communities. And so you'll see a street, a main street, and you know on one side people of one race live, and on the other side people of a different race live, and that is a story that repeats around the country. But we did something even more with the roads and street grids that I found really fascinating, because it wasn't enough to divide the communities and keep them separate. We had to make it really difficult to get from a black community to a white community. And we use these street planning techniques to do this under the guise of urban planning and street safety. So we did things like use one-way roads. We turned through streets into cul-de-sacs or into dead-end roads or abandoned streets. Atlanta, anybody from Atlanta? Okay. Oh, one person. I'm sorry, I'm gonna talk about y'all, because y'all were extra. Y'all did the most. Atlanta, at this time, used to call themselves the city too busy to hate, but they lied and they found time, because they really used a belt and suspenders approach. Because as I told you, they used I-20 and other highways to destroy black communities, but they wanted to make it hard to navigate between the two. So Atlanta has lots of one-way streets that lead you from formerly all black communities and away from white communities. So you could not get from the black community to the white community because all the streets were one-way streets in the opposite direction. And studies after studies have shown that that has contributed to Atlanta's tremendous traffic problem and the difficulty of getting around Atlanta because too many one-way streets all going in the same direction. Atlanta also would kind of abandon pieces of the road to separate black communities and white communities. There's one called Willis Mills Road, and people have wondered why there is a section of Willis Mills Road and then what seems like just a nice grassy area park, and then another section of Willis Mills Road. At one point, that was one through road, and the white community complained about black folks coming from their community to the white community, and so Atlanta abandoned that strip of road, just dug it up, and decided not to maintain it, so you couldn't continue to drive from the black community to the white community. Atlanta also did something unique. They wanted to spare white folks the indignity of having to say they lived on the same street with black folks. So when there was a through street that went from a black community to a white community, the name changed. And for our friend from Atlanta, it's Ponce de Leon Boulevard was one of the major dividing lines. And if you look, the street will have one name on one side of Ponce and change to a different name on the other side. And that would indicate to people the race of the folks who lived on that portion of the street. And in addition to having this kind of dignitary harm, it would indicate, as I said, the race of the people who live there. So you would know whether or not you wanted to go there to shop, if you wanted to look at a home, if you wanted to invest, if you wanted to deliver goods there, because you knew the race of the community by the name of the street. And then Atlanta did another thing. They kind of revolutionized building walls in the middle of the street. One example is what came to be known as Atlanta's Berlin Wall, which is on Peyton Road in Atlanta. And so a black surgeon who had graduated from Morehouse College decided to leave the segregated end of the street, racially segregated end of the street, and move to the white community and bought a house there. The community again went to the mayor and said, "You've got to stop this. We can't have this happening." And the mayor said, "Okay, I got you," and built a wall in the middle of the street to inhibit black folks driving into the white community. And the black community protested that wall and eventually burned it down, because Atlanta was also cheap and they built the wall out of wood. But they burned down the wall. Atlanta rebuilt it. And after it was rebuilt, the Ku Klux Klan guarded the wall 24 hours a day in full regalia, holding up signs that said white people have rights too. And it was not until black community went to court and got a federal judge to order that the wall be taken down that the community was then again connected. The Atlanta-Berlin Wall stood for about 75 days before it was taken down. Something similar happened in Memphis in the 80s, and it was a case that made it all the way to Supreme Court. There was a street called West Drive, and it was the main thoroughfare that connected the historically white community to the historically black community. And folks in the black community would drive down West Drive through the white community to get to downtown, which was on the other side, and to a park that was on the other side. And the white community decided that they didn't want those black folks driving through their community. They said that they wanted to stop what they called undesirable influences from coming into their community. And they went to the city and asked that the road be closed. And not part of a general kind of replanning of the streets in Memphis, just this one street, they built a wall that blocked right at the line between the black community and the white community. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, It's not a big deal. The black folks are making a big deal out of this. First, it's not about whether you were black or white. It was about where you lived. And the decision to build the road was just, that spot was chosen, and so you happen to live on this other side, and so therefore you are inconvenienced, and we're so sorry. And of course, they didn't acknowledge the deep racial segregation. At that point, the white community was 98% white, and the black community was in the 90s% black, and it was a deeply segregated. The Supreme Court didn't acknowledge that. They also said it's no big deal. Black folks can still get downtown. They can still get to the park. They just got to drive about 10 minutes around, and it's fine. So there's no real harm. Luckily, Thurgood Marshall was on the court, and because representation matters, and he said, no, it's not about counting minutes and counting miles to determine the harm. It is about the message that we are sending to the black community and to the white community about their relative value. It is about the harm that the government, it is state-sponsored segregation. But still, to this day, if you go down and go to West Drive in Memphis, it's still blocked off. That barrier was never removed, and those communities remained divided. Of course, it's still happening today. I represent this community in Sand Ridge, South Carolina. Have been fighting for 5 years, a road that is planned to destroy Sand Ridge. One of my students who has worked on the case with me for years and years, his mother is here today, and the audience is just lovely that she's here. But my students and I have been representing this community to fight to protect their homes. And of course, thousands of people are not going to displace. It's going to be dozens of people instead of thousands, but it's important, right? It's going to destroy that community, and the ones who are left behind are going to lose so much, not just their neighbors and their friends, because this is a community where everyone knows everyone. Their family. It was built by formerly enslaved people who were then became sharecroppers and were able to save money and to build this safe space for themselves. And now, as South Carolina was planning, they had 4 options for roads. All 4 went through Sand Ridge, and we're going to destroy Sand Ridge. No other option was on the table. One of the road that they ended up deciding, the plan that they ended up going with, there's a new white suburb that had been developed, and of course it is not going to be disturbed at all. But the developer of the white suburb also had a vacant plot of land in Sand Ridge that he was planning to build a storage facility. And in order to spare his vacant plot of land where his storage facility was going to go, the road takes a big turn, and in that process takes out 4 more houses and has this big loop in order just to save this man's vacant plot of land, destroying other people's homes. So another avenue, I'm going to try to move quickly because I want us to get to the panel and to Q&A, is public transportation. And I know people know about public transportation. It evolved under this cloud of explicit racism in the beginning, and now we are in a period of dog whistles and discrimination. We have what is now transportation deserts in black and brown communities because of lack of investment, right? We didn't think about how folks who didn't have cars could get around their own communities, how to connect them to other communities. But we also have transportation deserts in predominantly white communities by choice, because they want to keep out the black and brown folks who they see as using public transportation. And some of you all may remember a congressman named Newt Gingrich. Yeah, from Georgia, right? Used to be Speaker of the House of Representatives. And his quote is an example of kind of the focus that we have had on buses, which have gotten take a particular stigma as being racialized and kind of absorb a lot of harm. And in the 1990s, Cobb County, Georgia was fighting the extension of the bus stops into Cobb County from Atlanta. They didn't want folks who were coming from Atlanta to be able to take a bus to Cobb County. And he said, in their defense, people in Cobb County don't object to upper middle class neighbors who keep their lawn cut and move to the area to avoid crime. What people worry about is those folks and the bus line gradually destroying one apartment complex after another, bringing people out from public housing who have no middle-class values and whose kids, as they become teenagers, often are the centers of robbery, and where the schools collapse because the parents who live in the apartment complexes don't care that their kids don't do well in school, and then the whole school system collapses. He never once talked about race, but that whole quote was all about race. And we see that throughout our public transportation system, where it has been racialized and therefore fought, particularly buses. I came across a story of a young woman in Buffalo, New York, named Cynthia, 17 years old, worked in the food court at an upscale mall. And the mall would not let city buses into the parking lot. Let tour buses in, commuter buses could get in, but city buses could not get into the parking lot. And therefore, Cynthia and anyone else who's taking the bus had to take it to the bus stop across the street and race across 7 lanes of traffic to get into the parking lot, to go to work or to shop. And one day, as Cynthia was making that run across the parking lot, she was struck by a dump truck and killed. All because we are trying to block access to the economic opportunity that are in these suburbs and these white communities, making it hard for Black people and other people of color to get to these opportunities. I also came across a story in 2010, Beaver Creek, Ohio. Beaver Creek is a suburb of Dayton, and again, we have this upscale mall in Beaver Creek, people from Dayton trying to get to the mall to work or to shop. And it wasn't that the folks at Beaver Creek's mall, that they wouldn't let people come into the parking lot. They wouldn't allow bus stops at all in Beaver Creek. There were no bus stops. So anyone coming from Dayton would have to take it to the last stop, which was about 2 miles from the mall, and then walk the rest of the way. Large portions of that walk had no sidewalks. Half of that was over a highway overpass, I-675. I-675 had no sidewalks, no traffic calming measures to protect folks. They had to do that walk in the night, in the snow, in the rain, in the wind. And when the folks in Dayton got together with the Regional Planning Authority and said, we need you to have bus stops, Beaver Creek said, no, we don't represent those folks. The people we represent say they don't want those people coming here and turning our mall into the Dayton Mall, which was the mall where Black and brown folks shopped. So they went to the federal government, and at that point, the federal government was focused on increasing access to opportunity and said to Beaver Creek, you're going to build some bus stops so these people can get here. And Beaver Creek said, fine, we'll build some bus stops, but we have a few conditions. One, we need state-of-the-art surveillance cameras having live feed into the police department 24 hours a day. Nowhere else in the system did they have 24-hour surveillance feeding into the police department. And then they said, we'll need an 18-inch concrete pad at every bus stop. And I understand now that that's more in line with what you would have if an airplane was landing as opposed to a bus stopping. And then they said, finally, every bus shelter needed to be fully heated and fully air-conditioned. And at that point, the only fully air-conditioned bus stop in the world was in Dubai. And of course, we know it was not about wanting to make sure that the people who rode the buses were comfortable. It was all about keeping those people who they didn't want in their community out of their community. And finally, in the negative 5 minutes that I have left, I'm going to just talk very quick about pedestrian infrastructure. When I told people I was going to have a chapter on pedestrian infrastructure, they thought it'll be 2 pages long. What is there to talk about? And I learned about a really rich history around sidewalks being an important place to reinforce racial hierarchy, that folks who were enslaved in urban areas came into contact with white people daily life more often than folks who were enslaved on plantations, right, in the street and on the sidewalks. So there became codes around how people navigated, and that evolved into kind of a Jim Crow etiquette. And I learned about something called giving whites the wall, or the white man's right of way. And it was because the practice was for Black people to walk on the outside of the sidewalk near the street, which was less safe, and to give white folks the side where the wall was. And I talked to a man who said that today Black people have what they call the talk with their kids to make sure that as their kids leave the house, if they encounter police, that they can navigate that situation to come home safely. He said when he was growing up, his mother also had the talk with him, and that was about how to navigate white people on the sidewalk so that you would make sure that you came home safely. I tell people the story about Ferguson because, of course, we have a situation where there's lack of investment in pedestrian infrastructure in Black and brown communities. Study after study shows there are broken sidewalks, disconnected sidewalks, sidewalks that you can't navigate. One study showed that Boston is one of the most worst offenders in this as well as in Texas. And people know the story of Michael Brown in Ferguson, but they don't remember how that started. And Michael Brown was living in Ferguson, a community notorious for having broken sidewalks. Advocates had been demanding and asking for sidewalk investment for decades. And what we see time and time again, Black folks don't get investments in their communities. We get policing, we get punishment, and that's what happened. And so Michael Brown was walking with a friend in the street, because you can't walk on the sidewalks in Ferguson, stopped by the police to be ticketed for walking in the street, and then ended with him losing his life. And in the book, I talk about example after example of this happening around the country, where Black folks are targeted for walking in the streets, resulting in harm to themselves and loss of jobs and economic opportunity and other harms because we don't invest in pedestrian infrastructure. So all of this is also a story about the law. You would think that our civil rights laws would be strong enough and powerful enough to address some of these challenges. And of course, we as a country are better at making promises than we are at keeping them. And our civil rights laws make lots of promises that they don't keep. And transportation infrastructure really illuminates that we have evolved in civil rights law in a way that makes it hard to address this. We challenge problems after they've been happened, after decisions have been made, after the harm has been inflicted. We are looking for that one smoking gun, that one act of intentional discrimination, when we know that today it's more about how systems work and structures and compounded harm. And we put the burden on everyday citizens to first bring the litigation, whether or not they have the resources to do that, but then also to have the burden of proof, to discredit what government officials are saying and purporting without having the same tools to fight, to be able to fight on the same terms and in the same conversation. So I'm hoping we can have this conversation later, but so much needs to change about the way that we think about Black and brown communities, how we continue to house all the things that no one wants in those communities, treat them as the path of least resistance, don't think about how we create access to opportunity for them. And today, as our transportation infrastructure is crumbling, outliving its useful life, we have an opportunity to do something better, to actually build back better for everyone, to reconnect communities, and to make sure that everyone has access to resources and opportunity and good health. And so thank you for listening, and I look forward to the conversation and your questions.
Thank you, Deborah. I would like to invite our panelists to come take a seat on the stage. And as they do, I will briefly introduce them. This is an alphabetical order. Erica Blond is an Associate Vice President, Associate Fellow, and Senior Planner at HNTB with a decade-long career spanning resiliency, housing, and transportation. Her work focuses on community-focused planning, inclusive engagement, and the translation of transportation, mobility equity, and principles of transportation justice into major transportation programs, leading interdisciplinary teams for agencies, including the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, the MBTA, and the Bay Area Rapid Transit Authority. Erica is also a 2015 graduate of our Masters in Urban Planning program. Stephen Gray is an Associate Professor of Urban Design and the Director of the Urban Design Program here at the GSD. He is an urban designer, educator, and principal of Grayscale Collaborative, a research and design firm focused on spatial justice and equitable development. Stephen's research, teaching, and practice examine how race, capital, and infrastructure intersect to shape cities and are anchored by two core commitments: foregrounding the systems and ideologies of power that have historically and continuously shaped the field of urban design, and developing principles and methods for a practice that not only engages power more critically, but also envisions cities as places where more people can exercise agency over their own futures. Alex Krieger has combined a career of teaching and practice, dedicating himself to understanding how to improve both the quality of place and life in major urban areas. Alex is Professor in Practice of Urban Design, Emeritus, here at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He has served as chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design, I believe, 3 times. Also director of the Urban Design Program, and has been associate chair of the Department of Architecture. Alex is a principal at MBBJ, a global design practice, and he has provided architecture, urban design, and urban planning services to an array of clients in numerous cities worldwide. Etty Padmodipoetro is the founder and principal of Urban Idea Lab, specializing in infrastructure, architecture, and community development projects. A critical part of her practice has been balancing large-scale infrastructure projects with their surrounding neighborhoods. She believes in strong collaboration with communities and stakeholders to bring social equity through design. Etty was a Harvard Loeb Fellow in 2006 and was also just recently elevated to be an AIA Fellow in 2026. She's an active member of AIA, serving as a board member in 2024. She was the 2022 chair of the AIA Housing Awards and 2020 chair of the AIA Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community. So I'm very pleased to have all of you here to continue this conversation. I'll come join you and start our questions off. Just to give Deborah a chance to catch her breath, this first question is directed just to our panelists who've just joined the stage. I'd love for each of you to take a moment to reflect on your own practice in your respective disciplines, and comment on how your awareness and understanding of historical inequity, and not just historical inequity, current systems of inequity and injustice shape your approach to practice. And you can choose to focus on or reference specific projects that you've worked on, or to describe sort of an overall philosophy or approach. Maybe we'll go in the order that you're seated.
Sure.
We'll start with Stephen.
Thanks, and thank you for the talk. It is rare for somebody to come and not present slides, but you were captivating without slides, which was, it's a compliment. So how does this knowledge impact my practice? So I teach here, but I'm also a practitioner. Race is a construct. It was an invented thing to help people with power keep power and to sort of grow their access to capital. And so when we're working in contexts, whether they're under-resourced communities or they're highly resourced parts of cities, we need to be aware of that context. So when I approach a project, the first thing I really do is kind of interview the client. During the interview, I want to know if we share the same values, if they're interested in really understanding and addressing power imbalances within the places that we're going to work and the projects that we're working on. And then my approach, just in a sort of nuts and bolts way, is to really make sure that the communities that I'm working in are interested in the project that I'm going after, first of all. And second of all, that they're involved from a consultant side of the table in a sort of paid capacity. And that's really to try to sort of model and also have outcomes that demonstrate what shared power looks like, how to do it, and how that can actually be beneficial both to the receiving communities of the project, but also to the clients who are doing the work. One thing I just want to add to that, though, is that one of the things that is typical for designers and planners to do when we're doing work with these histories is to focus on those histories, is to analyze where there's deficiencies, where there was harm committed. That's important, and it's useful in getting grants and getting projects funded, but it also leaves a narrative of damage behind after the project is finished in communities that have had that be the entire narrative. And so one of the things that's really important in this work is to actually acknowledge that history, but lead with a desire narrative, really trying to sort of map out and understand what it is that people are proud of and excited about, and that is really the work that we focus on in my practice.
We used to work together. You had sort of given us an indication of what the question would be, and I must say it's a very difficult question for me because there's an assumption that I've always had an awareness of various injustices. That's not the case. Early in a career, and especially in mine back in the 70s, you were too worried about finding a client. You were trying to create a niche you were trying to inculcate into your projects the idealism that a design education provides. So actually, I must say, I'm confessing, it took me quite a while to begin to think in these terms. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Lo and behold, a few years later, we were involved in 3 highway projects, not to build them, but to, overcome their problems. One was the Big Dig, which I spent a long time on, and how could you not feel like you're on the side of God because you were going to demolish a highway, right? Get it out of sight, right? A second was working on a master plan for the turnpike of capping this trench. By the way, most of it still has to be kept, and most of the reasons it hasn't been kept is, other than money, is actually NIMBYism, of not wanting to be connected across the trench by some neighborhoods. And the third was in Cincinnati, and I think Professor Archer talks about the kind of dividing line produced in Cincinnati, and this was one of those highways, and we fortunately wound up this kind of building, able to build 5 streets across the trench as a way to kind of connect the fabric. But at that time, we weren't thinking about racial injustice or inequalities. We were happily thinking about how we're improving the world. Hey, we were going to cover a trench. We're going to eliminate a highway. We were proud, but not very thoughtful about the implications that may have led to the original construction of these projects. So actually, it was not until a bit later on, and I want to talk about one project in particular, when you realize that you have to start in the way just like you described, right? But that doesn't mean that you weren't occasionally implicated in producing something that you didn't intend that actually led to another form of at least minimal inequality or oftentimes injustice. So we were retained to Buffalo, and Buffalo's, you talk about that, and one of its dividing Main Street, this way, okay, for us whites, that way, no. So Buffalo hired us to help establish a medical center, Buffalo Niagara Falls Medical Center. It's now incredibly successful. And so, yes, but it was on the other side of the bad side of the tracks, right? And so immediately you understood that if it was to grow, it was going to grow at the expense of its neighbors. Now, of course, fortunately, and I say this with quotes, fortunately, the devastation had occurred some time ago. So there was lots of land there of parking lots and abandoned properties and so forth. So we thought we were going to be, we tried very hard to say, okay, we're going to create boundaries that should not expand across these particular areas so as to kind of invade the neighborhood. We introduced sort of cross streets and insisted that those streets be improved into the neighborhoods themselves, especially a particular neighborhood on the east side called the Fruit Belt, long kind of an immigrant enclave, but becoming actually over the past 40 years or so as a kind of a disadvantaged neighborhood, largely minority. We insisted that in the guidelines for the plan that the parking lots would be the first to be used for expansion because no more parking lots could be allowed, the garages would be built, and you'd built expansion. So we thought that we had, to the extent possible, inculcated the impacts of this against the neighborhood. That was actually, suffering, but kind of, doing okay and so forth, right? And we insisted that the ministers of 2 important churches join the planning committee and sort of help us think these 2 things. Well, great. We felt pretty good about this. Within 5 or 6 years, the success of this was so extraordinary, and was so important to the economy of Buffalo, and indeed actually to the economy of Western New York State, that this thing began to kind of push up against its boundaries. And so when we were invited back to do an update, all of a sudden, we were involved in having to decide which properties were going to be taken. And by that time, obviously, the neighborhood along the edges were beginning to decline even more, and the parking lots were all filled in. And so here's a case where the success of a project, based upon as good planning ideas as we could have sort of included, now was leading to a substantial issue about more and more impact on this neighborhood. Indeed, a couple of blocks of housing, actually fairly, in bad shape, were demolished. We were able to kind of insist that better housing would be built. Replacement housing would be built, but whether that actually took place efficiently and for the right people and so forth, who knows? And 25 years later, there's still a great crisis that occurs there between, of course, the continuing growth. Medical centers never shrink. They never shrink. The continuous growth of this now world-famous medical center and this neighborhood that now continues to be, at the moment, of course, less concerned with additional demolition, but more concerned with gentrification, which continues to happen, and indeed, through gentrification, substantial change happening in the neighborhood. So I mentioned this because I think that sometimes, even with your sort of best instincts, but when the limitations of what you're asked to do, you actually wind up becoming implicated in something that you don't actually have full control over.
Yeah,
I'll wait for the next important question.
I think this is, can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Briefly.
Briefly. Well, that's why I think, you working with those two pastors was important, but going beyond that and actually centering, this is old news, right? But now, as we are looking forward to all of these infrastructures that Professor Archer says indicates very honestly and clearly that are going to be rethought at a scale far beyond that single project, we really need to be making sure that communities are part of imagining what that is. Because I would guess that if they were the clients, some of those things could have been avoided just by virtue of what they expected out of that process and out of that project for their neighborhood.
Not to monopolize this.
Yeah, sorry.
There was lots of public input originally, and everyone seemed happy that we drew a boundary, and everyone was happy that we made kind of other important suggestions about parking lots first. But in this case, the dominance of this institution started to overwhelm. And continues to do so, actually, to this present day in this neighborhood, right?
Thank you. Erica.
Thank you, and thank you, Carole and Professor Archer. It is really an honor to be on this panel and not at all intimidating, so it's good. So when I was at the JSD, I started working with the city of Chelsea. I've been working with the community for a long time, just north of Boston, and we were tasked in our studio second semester, first year, of doing community engagement to figure out how we were going to shape our master plan. And there was a lot of concern from our class around how we were going to maintain the community fabric exactly as it was, and a lot of concern around gentrification, redevelopment. What was surprising to me was when I went out into the city and actually talked to the residents, they were actually quite interested in some of the redevelopment that was being discussed, but they wanted the ability to maintain their residents in their homes and to afford living in Chelsea and have safe bike and pedestrian access and access to Boston. And so it's when I think I came up with this term, or maybe I didn't come up with it, but maybe it was parachute planning, kind of like an Artemis 2, just like straight from space into the community, and how detrimental that was to our process, and how important it was to work with the community to define what they were perceiving as community need and community benefit, as opposed to what I was an urban planner prioritizing. And then when I left the GSD, I went to work for the city of New York for the Department of Housing, Preservation and Development. And what was really striking to me was the scale at which we were working. It was the Hurricane Sandy Build It Back program, and just the sheer volume of disaster funding and the urgency with which we were approaching the recovery was great to see, but it reminded me of a lot of the reading and learning I had done around Hurricane Katrina, and how by contrast in New Orleans there was such an incredible lack of urgency, an incredible lack of funding stream coming into those communities. And what it really illustrated for me was sort of how the losses were framed as urgent and repairable in a lot of the parts of New York where I was working, and maybe not so much in some of the other communities that were shaped by the historic inequities that Professor Archer was talking about. And so once I moved into the transportation space full-time, a lot of my research has been around bus stop standardization and how bus stops and public transportation really are the front door to access for a lot of people, and how we can better connect these stops to the larger bike and pedestrian network, and push back on a lot of harmful assumptions about, in transportation, we talk a lot about transit-dependent riders. I really hate that term because we should be viewing our riders as customers and their trust in us as something that we really have to earn as transportation agencies and as consultants. We shouldn't excuse poor service because we perceive people as having fewer options. And then kind of something else that I've been noticing in my research, especially in communities in Western Massachusetts and other parts of the state, is that, public transportation isn't the answer for all people, which maybe is not a great take as an urban planner and someone who does care a lot about bike and pedestrian infrastructure, but I work with a lot of extremely vulnerable communities, really passionate about working with communities of formerly incarcerated persons who have different relationships with the way that they want to get around, and ultimately the thing that everyone shares is wanting to have a dignified experience in transportation. And so my job, while I would love it to be getting everyone onto their bicycles and on sidewalks and into trains, that's not it. My job is to figure out how they want to get around and find a really respectful, dignified way to do that. And so some of the work that I'm doing today, just to touch on quickly, is actually with Etty. We're working on the Tobin Bridge master planning study. Tobin Bridge connects Boston with the city of Chelsea, so I'm engaging Chelsea, Charlestown, and the region, and really asking what the public wants out of this new crossing. And one of the ideas that folks have is for a tunnel, which would be great in some ways, and in other ways could be really problematic when we think about some of the issues that Chelsea has had and continues to have around affordability. You blow open all of this new space for redevelopment on the waterfront. It would be great from an environmental justice perspective. This community has suffered so much in so many ways from the Tobin Bridge, and this would be a real opportunity. But if we're smart about it and we don't see this strictly as a transportation project, but as an opportunity to do master planning correctly and kind of repair some of the harms and relationships that public agencies have unfortunately had with the public. And kind of to close on that thought, there is also this idea of the city of Chelsea being the host infrastructure for the Tobin Bridge. So a lot of the people that use the Tobin, most of the vehicles on the bridge are coming from the North Shore and not actually the people in the community who are suffering from the lead paint and other ailments that this very old bridge has. And so one of the questions I keep coming back to is how do we design a system that serves regional mobility but also really serves the host community that we're in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to read it because there's so much to talk about. So first, I want to thank you because for writing this book, it should be a required reading for architects, engineers, and politicians, government workers. We know that highways severed and destroyed neighborhoods. The evidence is everywhere. What this book laid out is how systematic and intentional it was. The government weaponized infrastructure to destroy neighborhoods. It was not, as we have been told, about going through blighted areas. It became blighted because of the highway. So there's a lot to unpack in this book. Highway of the past is actually designed for 50 years life cycle. I'm doing highway all the time. I'm working in the trenches, so I know this. Majority were built in the 60s and 70s. So that's why highways now are primed to be redone, overhauled, and because they're all in disrepair. They're all in need of replacing. So construction cost for this is in the trillions. The new infrastructure, I have has to be done for 75 years to 100 year cycle. So it's almost double than what we have before. So basically, we are going to live with this for generations. So this is from me, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. We must reimagine how we design our infrastructure for the future. The book is very timely. Thank you. So, our office specializes in infrastructure and community development. We are architects, landscape architects, urban designers, planners, and so on. Our mission is always to collaborate with communities and stakeholders to ensure social equity. Strangely, however, the key to having a successful project is actually working collaboratively with the engineers, because they are the prime and they are the one that's going to build it. We cannot do it unless we work closely with them. And then through that, we work with the community and collaborate with them. Now, these projects are gazillion billion dollars, like one of our bridge, or several of our bridge, one bridge is $250 million. So it takes years to develop. So there is time to figure out how to make a context-sensitive design. So in doing that, I do agree we need to diversify the team. We need to not only include all of us, but we need to also include community activists, historian, social scientists. We have to create a big tent in terms of figuring out what's the best way to move forward. I learned about infrastructure from working on the Big Dig, or Central Artery Project. At the time, that was the most expensive project in the country. And so it took a long time. There's a lot of social experiments as well as technological experiments. And somebody had the vision to make sure that the community was part of the process. We did a lot of, over years, meeting bi-weekly with the community. The part that I'm working on was the East Boston community. So now if you go there, they now have parks, they have housing, they have commercials, they have schools. When they did the SEIS, which is environmental impact statement, all they promised the community was a 30-foot wall over 3,000 feet long. And what I did was working closely with the community and try to figure out what is it that they want. And what was interesting, the engineers, and I'm sure they're still doing this, what they understand is costs. So what I did was I cost out the wall and using the same cost to pay for what the community wanted. And please go there, because it did transform the community then, and it's still transforming the community now. And the other project that is also, that we were doing is actually near my house, is they're taking down an overpass called the Casey Overpass. And again, that used a lot of community participation. And now once it's down, a lot of these vacant land that were decades empty are now housing and commercials and all this stuff. So I'm basically a little bit more optimistic. I think we can do it, but we really need everyone, all of you, to be part of this field.
Thank you, Etty. That's actually, your response was like an excellent segue into the next question, which is, we've heard some reflection on sort of the past, and I really appreciate that among the panelists here, we have people reflecting at different points in time in their career and different points in time I don't want to use the word history because that makes it sound longer ago. But the next question I want to focus on looking forward with hope to the future. and about the agency we have and the ability we have to shape the future. I'd love to hear from, perhaps from Deborah first, if that's okay. Or we can save you till the end if you'd prefer to have the last
I'll go in the
word.
middle. I talked a lot. So let's, yeah.
Great. Then we'll start on this side again. What can planners, designers, design professionals do? Where can we intervene to create more just systems and more just places and more just environments?
So I think your comment, Etty, about the time horizon and the sort of, designing for 75 years, 100 years, it's generations. And Deborah, your closing comment about the opportunity that is at hand with infrastructure reuse, I think infrastructure reuse is our one biggest shot in a generation to really think about cities from an equity perspective and not only address the harms that Deborah talks about in her book and discussed today, not only address the fact that they're crumbling infrastructures and they need to be rebuilt or removed or just rethought or reimagined, as Etty said, but I think also because these physical infrastructures are kind of the definition of urban design and of cities. They organize housing, they organize economic development, they organize environmental issues, they organize people. And so as we're rethinking these large infrastructures, it's our opportunity to really get it right, to acknowledge that harm, but also to imagine a different way forward.
So I'm unprepared.
You can jump over
We
you.
can skip around.
Okay. So with all the optimism that I said before, unfortunately, on this case, there are some problem ahead because of how the administration is now. And so basically, in my world, we cannot talk about DEI anymore. We cannot talk about racial, that we are trying to alleviate the racial impact of the past. There's a lot of things that we cannot say, and they're threatening of pulling the entire funding, even if it's already fully funded. But again, it's a call to action that we can figure it out. And actually, your book give us a little bit of tidbits on how to do, actually it was bad. It's like how the racists are doing racist things without saying that they're racist. We can do the opposite, right? Absolute opposite.
That's what we do. That's what we need to do.
We will do social justice, and we will do, environmental justice, but we won't have to say it. We have to say it differently. So, anyway.
Yeah, I'm going to put on a different hat because I want you to say it and speak truth, right? So I cannot not say that you can talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. You can talk about racial justice. You can talk about repairing the harm from what we've done. The fact that there may be people in the federal administration that say we don't want you to doesn't actually change the law. There's nothing illegal about talking about. There's nothing illegal about having these discussions. There's nothing illegal about wanting to engage particular communities in conversations. And that is not to say that there are not risks, right? Because folks can be targeted and lose funding, and so there are risks. But I'm hoping that those who can will speak up and will fight back and will push, because that's the way we're going to get things changed for everyone. And for those who have, various risks and cannot feel like they cannot be the face of it, that they cannot step forward, that they cannot speak truth, and that they cannot be kind of out there in front. I understand that everyone has a different tolerance for risk, and so I appreciate still that people will do the work that needs to be done, even if they call it something different. Because at the end of the day, I do think it's important to call it what it is, to speak truth to power, to speak truthfully about what happened, why we're where we are, because if we don't talk about how we got here honestly and openly, we're going to repeat the sins of the past. But if you can't and you can still do the work, then I appreciate you all still doing the work anyway. And in terms of the path forward, I think you all each talked about the elements of what I see as important moving forward. One, not seeing the current conditions in our communities as a neutral starting place, acknowledging the harm, acknowledging that some communities have had to bear more than others, and integrating that into your designs and your proposals. We talked about community engagement. For me, kind of getting community input is not sufficient. Kind of having a forum where people voice their concerns, share their ideas. I want us to have places where the community has real power, a real role in deciding and shaping what happens in their communities. People know what's good for them. What they don't have are the tools and resources and support to help make that vision a reality. I talked about Indianapolis and I-65 and I-70. There's an organization called the Rethink Coalition that have been working with communities impacted by that highway as INDOT decides to rebuild it. In the beginning, INDOT, Indianapolis Department of Transportation, showed the community plans, and they said, this is what we're going to do. And the community was like, fine, it looks like what y'all have done forever. You're going to take some more homes to expand the highway and rebuild it. You're going to put up walls. I guess that's what you do, and we need highways. I guess there's no other way. And because of gentrification, there was an urban planner and an architect that was living in the community, and they said, we're going to build some plans and show you more visually what they're planning to do to your community, and to our community. And when they did that, the folks in the community said, hell no, that we're not going to stand by and let that happen. We need to fight. And they continued to get resources donated to them to fight in the same terms that INDOT had. So they got folks to build alternative plans, to do alternative air quality studies and noise studies, to look at the cost measures, to build alternative plans and solutions that were better for the community. And it not only transformed this project, but now it has transformed the way that the Indianapolis Department of Transportation does everything. The way that they engage the community meaningfully and give them the resources, the language and tools to fight. I worked with a community in Watts, California. They were trying to make a road more safe for the community. It was a road where people race down. Studies show that drivers slow down less for black and brown pedestrians. They were losing lots of family members and community members on this road to the cars racing down. And the solution that was proposed is we're going to put more stop signs and stoplights there to slow traffic. But the community did not want more punishment. They did not want solutions that were going to subject them to more punishment. And because they got support and resources from professionals who donated their time, they learned that if you planted trees, traffic would slow down. If you had plants along the road, traffic would slow down. If you put seats along the road, traffic would slow down. And so they were able to get those measures put in so that they could be safer, less targeted. And they also learned that the community used to have trees. Those trees were cut down at the request of the LAPD because it was interfering with surveillance by helicopter. And so it was important for them to understand that history and have that woven in as well. But I do believe that the participation of the community, and then the last thing I'll mention is the long-term planning. You were mentioning, there's this investment, but the investment, even investments around transportation infrastructure and making the communities places people want to come back to can lead to displacement for people who have been building their lives for decades in the shadows of those highways. And we don't want the investment in the transformation in how we engage in transportation infrastructure to lead to the displacement of those communities. So it's not just short-term investment in the community, it's a long-term investment that makes sure that people are not going to have to sell their homes because they can't afford property taxes, to make sure that renters who have rented there for decades can continue to rent there, that the mom and pop shops are going to be able to stay. So it's long-term, durable investment that is going to make sure that all of the transformation that we see around this infrastructure will not lead to displacement in the community.
Yeah.
Long-term, I think, is very important.
Could you speak?
Before I say something about that, infrastructure somehow over the course of the last century has been the province of specialists. And that's been one of the problems. And you know, I'm not going to assume that every engineer who worked on a highway was themselves a racist. But somehow, the mindset of a specialist is, I have been given this job to do, I'm going to do it as efficiently and as quickly and as economically as possible. So one of the problems, it's easy to say, let's get everyone involved. Okay, fine. Okay, that and $2 will get you on the tee. Mm-hmm. How do you actually get the right people involved at the moment at which decisions are made? That's actually much more important than just saying everyone's got to be involved, of course, right? And so one of the things that I hope is happening now is that the notion of that specialist who knows how to do one thing very well. You've got to admit that the interstate highway system has been an incredible technological achievement despite the horrors that it produced, right? But because you have to overcome singular variables, right? Singular objectives, as opposed to, if you think long term, obviously, you have to think about multiple objectives as opposed to singular objectives. And the Department of Transportation for 100 years, however long it's existed, has been the Department of Cars. It's not carousels, right? And so one of the things that hasn't come up yet, but and I don't know, how you get it to come around is, in the same way that specialists think about single variables and efficiency, as a society, we have not talked about the multiple means by which people need to move in order to make successful cities, right? And so the revolution has to take place is for the Department of Transportation to become known as the Department of Transportation, not cars, and a similar amount of intensity has to be devoted in this country to transit. And unless that happens, it will still be just where we are. By the way, for all the good things about the Big Dig, there's twice as much elevated highway in Boston as there was then, at least. Because somehow still the focus was on getting more cars through as opposed to investing a cent in a rail corridor that was supposed to be part of the original planning between North Station and South Station, which would have been a good idea. I've spent a long time, and I will not live long enough at all, championing the idea of an urban ring, because this idea of transit is a 19th century idea. Every transit line heads to Park Street over there, and guess what? Not everyone needs to go there. In fact, there's all kinds of sort of inequalities by the fact that folks who have to get from there to there, where the jobs are, for example, all the folks in Roxbury and Dorchester who want to work in the Longwood Medical area can't get there without going first downtown and then back out, right?
And on buses, not trains.
Well, and buses, yeah, right. So somehow we also have to, I hate sort of platitudes. Yes, we all have to work together, and I think we have to advocate for transportation as being about multiple ways in which to move around, whether there's better sidewalks or more planted greenways. But damn it, in this country, we've got to get on with figuring out how to improve substantially our transit system, because that also has a very substantial equity issue. So I'll end with my favorite criticism about transit in America, right? The distance from Nanjing to Shanghai is approximately the same distance, within 20 miles, of the distance from New York to Boston. How many of you have taken the Turtle Acela lately? How long does it take? At best. Okay? 55 minutes on the express, all right? 55 minutes. Imagine if we had if we were able to get from Boston to New York in 55 minutes on a transit system. Well, anyway, I guess, but on a transit system. So I'm going to get off my high horse,
yeah,
but I think
Alex,
transit, I think, has to become far more important. How to do it, how to fund it, who knows? And that's when we have to, yes, get all together and do it.
So what that makes me think, though, the questions I have is who is going from Boston to New York, and how do you get that speed? You have to straighten out the track quite a bit. And what do you do when you straighten it out? You suddenly have to cut through neighborhoods and cities and things. These things all get sort of wound up into the conversation again. So again, it's about asking that question, but also then asking for whom and at what expense.
But that, yes, but ask those questions and stop yourself from getting what you actually want to achieve. I don't buy that entirely. Yes, major infrastructure projects have impacts. You want to be most intelligent about minimizing those negative impacts, but they shouldn't stop you from doing something that ultimately would benefit society as a whole.
Thank you. Erica.
Sure, and I'm working on that right now, Stephen, on the ACLU and the realignment. I'll keep it fast. 3 things really for me: pay people to be involved. I'm a consultant. I get paid to go and use my expertise in communities. The community organizations that we work with, the advocates, the public that we work with deserve to get paid for the expertise that we're expecting them to bring to the table. 2, I'm working a lot right now, and Deborah, you talk a lot about NEPA, or you have a few 5 or 6 pages on the National Environmental Policy Act in your book. And right now I'm kind of in the fight of my life trying to figure out how to still use the remaining scaffolding that we do have around Title VI regulations and the National Environmental Policy Act to keep doing the right thing, kind of in the cover of night. And then ultimately, and I hope no one from work is watching this, but I don't really work for HNTB or DOT or Federal Highway or any of the agencies. All of us work for the people. We work for communities. And so I think that's something I'm really trying to keep in mind also.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Oh, do we have some microphone runners? Okay, great. Right here.
Thank you, Professor Archer. That was an amazing talk. The rest of you were all good too, but Professor Archer, you were just really fabulous. A couple of, both Alex and Etty mentioned about the big dig, but I've worked a lot on the Highways to Boulevards program, or that, the movement that you have in a lot of different cities. And it's not just about burying the highways, it's about removing them entirely, like taking down I-81 through Syracuse and really creating greater connectivity. I would love your perspective on kind of what you think about those efforts. I think, there's like 50 or 60 really active projects right now.
I actually started this work working with the community in Syracuse on I-81, forever ago at the beginning, because the community thought that the racial history of I-81 was not being discussed, and that racial justice, civil rights was not at the center of the conversation, and reached out and asked if we could come up and help them, and so spent years working with the folks in Syracuse. So I think it's really important that where we can, to take down the highways altogether and to create connectivity. I believe that. But now you might not like me when I say this other part. I just don't think we can say it's a universal solution, right? Because for some rural communities, the highway is their connection to economic opportunity. So I'm very careful to say, if we can, I am in favor of that, absolutely. But it cannot be a universal solution just because there are some people who will absolutely lose connectivity altogether if they are not connected by the highway. And so thinking very strategically about where we advocate for tearing it down and where we think about how to do it differently.
So when Etty talks about rebuilding,
I think they're going to make you wait to get the microphone.
When
Etty
talks about rebuilding it, the hair on the back of my neck got up, because to me, given the fact that it's going to cost, billions of dollars to rebuild something, you have to think, is there a better way to achieve that same kind of mobility within that community, but yet not, and again, to have greater longevity for that infrastructure while increasing access to opportunity.
Yeah. And the rebuilding is just knee-jerk. I'm working with the community in North Carolina on this as well, that the highway folks are saying, well, it's not our fault. Yes, we acknowledge the racist history. We know it destroyed communities. We know it's creating harm, but it's already there. And so the easiest way for us to move forward is to just kind of adjust this highway, expand this highway, add more lanes, and not really thinking creatively in the way that I know that you are thinking more creatively.
I have to jump in right here. When I talk about rebuilding, I don't mean rebuilding it as is. I am talking about we need to reimagine what we want for the future, because we're going to live with it for 100 years. That is generations. And that's why I'm always doing a call for action, because right now, trillions of dollars are thrown in to do something, and the train is leaving. We have to join and work on this field. I'm a niche. It should not be a niche. It should be mainstream. There should be gazillion of me doing these things. So it's a call to action. Thank you.
And I love that you're talking about it in terms of 100 years. I've told in other talks, one of my favorite quotes is from the movie Dune, which I shouldn't acknowledge that I've seen or watched, but they have a line that says, our plans are measured in centuries. And that is how I think about all of civil rights work, that we are very good at short term. We are very good at being reactionary, but we are not very good at having a grand vision and working and thinking about the building blocks to get us there. And so I was glad that you emphasized, we're going to live with this for a century. Let's think about it meaningfully and build the blocks so that a century from now, we are living the dream of justice and equality and inclusion that we all imagine.
Thank you. And this will be our final question. So who wants to be the note that we end on? So there's going to be some pressure.
Let's accommodate at least 2 more. How about that? There's some people up there.
Okay.
I'm just going to say, the guy in the gray sweatshirt in the middle, his hand was up first. I'm just going to say that. I'm not playing favorites.
And please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jingze. I study urban planning here, a first-year student. Thank you, Professor Archer, for this wonderful talk. We had the GSC Mobility Club had a mixer last week, I think. And when I introduced myself to people, I was like, what I'm most passionate about is giving people nice things. I feel like we've lost the ability to build nice things. That includes transportation infrastructure, of course. So I'm incredibly interested in this debate around gentrification and NIMBYism, around giving people nice things. When we talk about protected bike facilities or we talk about better transit, a lot of folks are against it because they feel like it's going to gentrify them and displace them. But don't people deserve nice things?
Yes.
Next question. No.
Yes, of course we all deserve nice things. But I do want to ask you, Professor Archer, so gentrification fears at the moment actually are preventing certain things from happening. So how can we, in other words, I've been involved in many street improvement projects or open space projects where an awful lot of folks start to worry about if that happens, there'll be impact. So do you have any recommendation? I'm going to ask you to answer the question. How to kind of overcome that real but sometimes exaggerated fear so that nice things or worthwhile efforts actually to move us away from the car or whatever can be achieved. Right?
I want our communities to have nice things. I want all of our communities to have nice things, and I think we can. I often get the question about the abundance theory. I want us all to have abundance, right? Because when we don't have enough, the communities that I work with are the ones who are most often deprived. So nice things, beautiful things, lots of things. Yes, displacement is a real concern. But it doesn't mean we throw our hands up. We've addressed lots of challenging problems, and we can get smart folks together to puzzle through. So there are lots of communities that have anti-displacement ordinances that help secure resources. The folks in Portland that are providing funding to get people to come back or to give you loans. Yes, it's in the last chapter, right? But there are community land trust agreements, all kinds of ways that we can protect people, and some people will have to leave. if that has to happen, we can do it respectfully, and help them land in a meaningful way, help them land in similar communities, help them land well where they can continue their lives and grow their lives. The displacement that happens too often is you're out of luck, good luck finding some place to live, and they're left to their own devices and end up in worse situations. So I think we, acknowledging the problem is part of it, and then kind of using our resources to meaningfully limit the amount of displacement and to help people who are displaced.
I think timing is an important consideration here as well, because a lot of those things are more effective, and community land trusts and homeowner stabilization programs, those kind of things are more effective, more cost effective, more impactful, and more successful when they come before the project and not after the project. 11th Street Bridge Park is probably the poster child of like the opposite of the High Line, where they anticipated all the things and they haven't even broken ground yet, and have basically spent more money on community investment and community stabilization programs prior to the project than the project will even cost when it's built, and it's only going to break ground this summer. So that's one example. Another is, if people have to leave, they should be able to leave on their own terms and with a lot of money in their pocket. So for example, if the neighborhood is going to change, there's one project I worked on in Uptown Cincinnati, and when the project was done, one of the things that one of the large institutions, medical institutions, did was they created a $35,000 low-interest homeowner stabilization loan for black folks that had been living there for a long time, and now things were about to start to change and investment was going to come. And so what the terms of the loan were, basically, if you stayed in your home for 5 years, it was forgiven. So what that meant was people that stuck it out and watched their home property go down and down and down and down, right at the moment where someone's going to knock at the door and say, I'll give you $10 more than you thought it was worth, and then they're going to take it and leave, the neighborhood's broken apart, they now have an opportunity to fix up their home at low interest, and if they stay for 5 years long enough, the loan is forgiven. So that keeps people in place long enough to decide, maybe, you know what, things have changed in the way that I like them. The sidewalks are fixed. The bike lanes are kind of cool. My grandkids are here riding their bikes. Like, maybe I want to stay. And if I don't, I can now sell my house that has been fixed up and appreciated through a market for 5 extra years for more than I would have got for that $10 developer offer. So there are ways to do these things that don't have to hurt, that can actually benefit people and get nice things.
Yeah. I just want to say that the problems or the challenge that's coming up is extremely complicated. And I think it would be good if we can learn to put our ideas out there open source. So then we can start swapping these ideas and learning from each other. Because I think that's the only way we can get to something that is imaginative and creative.
Thank you. I'm going to follow Alex's suggestion to allow one more question. So this one really, this will be the note that we end on.
Make it good.
I will go up here. Yeah. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Brian. I'm a Cambridge resident, full-time lawyer, part-time urban design enthusiast. My question is this, and thank you all. This has been very informative and interesting. But my question is this. So kind of woven through what you all talked about was the need to involve stakeholders in the process and get the opinions of people who will be affected by a project. But I know the permitting process, I know the input process, I know the studies and everything can be used to maintain the status quo by people who maybe don't want change. So how do you kind of conceptualize where to draw that balance and, ensure you're getting true feedback without allowing that to delay progress?
I got an answer, but I don't.
No, you go ahead.
Well, we experienced it. I was talking with my colleagues up here earlier at Blue Hill Avenue. So we were leading the Blue Hill Avenue Transportation Action Plan, and just very quickly, the folks that were showing up were drivers who were older and understood the system and how to work the politics, and sent all caps emails and copied every elected official in the state every time they did. And they had been living in a neighborhood that had been bypassed that has no trains, and the buses suck. And so they eventually bought cars, and they don't want a center running bus lane to take a lane up when they finally have cars. Where you're gonna make me slow down even more now? And so we looked at the analysis, but the analysis said that more than half of the people on the corridor every day were riding the bus, but they weren't showing up, or they weren't speaking up because it felt dangerous to say something. And so we had to go in all sorts of different ways and have small group conversations, have youth targeted outreach, have pop-ups in bars where we invited agencies, multiple agencies from the city to come and talk about all the different projects happening in and around the corridor. And basically, we collected, 2,000, 2,500 different audio recorded inputs, and we said, this is the counterbalance to those 3 people that keep showing up and saying this is what the community wants. And ultimately, as consultants, you usually make a recommendation. What we did was we were working with community-based organizations and church leadership and our client at the city and the state, and we as a core group decided, after meeting for 2 years every week together, that we were not going to make a recommendation. The mayor was going to make a decision. We were going to put forth 2 scenarios, the one with the center running bus lane. MBTA is going to write a big check for that. The one without, they're taking their money. So what can you get with that? And then the mayor who ran on that then would be the person who would decide, because she was most accountable to the people. And that's how we sort of navigated that situation.
Okay. Great. Great.
Center running bus lanes are coming, and Etty's working on the project.
So unfortunately, the
Etty, your
mayor.
microphone.
Oh, sorry. Unfortunately, the mayor has not decided yet, so now it's on hold. But we are ready to do something that is not only will be beautiful in the bus, but also creating spaces for people along the bus lane. So hopefully it'll be soon.
So it's good to have a success story, but to your point, I don't think we should underestimate the fact that we've come to a point where it takes an inordinately long time to get many things done, and it'll require many more success stories. So I'm going to end on a point that maybe piss off a couple of folks. We also have to find a way to re-educate urban dwellers. It's not just about your neighborhood. It is not just about your neighborhood. If you want to live in a city, you have to have an equal regard for the city overall. And in fact, there's too much attention, I think now, devoted to, okay, I live in JP, I'm going to think what's great for JP. But you know what? A city is always for 3 kinds of individuals: those who came before, those who are here kind of struggling to make a go of it now, and also those who are not yet here. So there's a certain amount of re-education, and I hate to use that word because that sounds in order to live in a city, you cannot only be interested in the street that you live on.
The challenge we have when we look at history is that the people who have to be educated in how they share the city have never had a choice. And the people who have had a choice continue to, because they work the zoning rules around to their benefit. And so, yes, there is a sort of coming together and a sort of idea of a shared reality that we have, and that's what's so great about living in cities. But the people with the tools and the power and the know-how have tended to make sure that there's less of the people who have those opinions, and that they get more of the benefit that those lesser people get inflicted with. And so, it's hard to...
But those people need as much re-education as those that you're aware of.
I agree.
Because if you're living in a city, you have a responsibility to think about...
You hold your microphone.
It's okay, it's not important. It's recorded anyway. Anyway, it's time to go, right?
It is. I have enjoyed and appreciated this conversation so much. I would like to thank Professor Archer and all of our panelists for making it